Welcome to the second Power to Your Business webinar. What you need to know about the finance, the funding, and the return on investment as you consider the switch to solar. Brought to us today by Solarsense. On-site renewable energy generation is helping thousands of UK businesses become more sustainable, reduce costs, and achieve long-term energy security. But how do businesses pay for it and justify that investment? My name is Dave Harries, and in today's webinar, we address some of the financial questions and issues you may be facing as you consider the switch to solar energy or even expanding an existing solar installation. We have an expert panel to help us look at finance, funding, and the ROI of your business. Peter Booth is Group Finance Director of MC Group, one of the UK's leading suppliers of commercial transport solutions in the UK. The company used SmartEase finance and worked with Solarsense on its second and later solar installations. Kevin Mulvaney is a sustainability consultant for England Rugby and Vice Chair of the Board of Directors for St Mary's Old Boys Rugby Union Football Club in Bristol, where he managed a £57,000 solar and battery storage project. Ellie Smith has a career spanning over 3 decades in commercial banking and has established herself as a prominent figure in asset finance, as well as being a driving force behind the renewable energy sector market at Ignition Credit. She specialises in renewable energy funding solutions and has played a pivotal role in several large-scale, high-profile solar projects. And Gaige is SmartEase's UK National Sales Director and has worked with companies across the UK to find and deliver payment solutions for those who want to benefit from renewable energy and move forward towards net zero. SmartEase work in partnership with Solarsense to provide funding for solar energy projects. And last but certainly not least is Stephen Barrett. Stephen is the MD and founder in 1995 of Solarsense, which has since installed more than 15,000 renewable energy systems in the UK. As the sponsor of today's webinar, I'd like to invite Stephen to kick us off with a little bit of background to where we are now with regards to solar power and the difference it's making. So, Stephen, over to you.
Yes, thank you, David, and thank you, everybody, for joining. Today's topic is clean energy finance. So when I started Solarsense some 28 years ago, basically there was no financial return. People mainly installed solar for environmental reasons, often with government grants. But nowadays we find we don't need any of that. The advances in technology mean the payback we've seen this year of 2 to 3 years, which we've never seen before. Even when the government had a feed-in tariff, the payback went down to about 5-6 years. So it's the perfect time now to be looking at solar energy, and it's great to see that businesses can now invest, get a good return, and save on the environment.
So you mentioned, sorry, Stephen, interrupting you there. You mentioned there grants and the sort of feed-in tariffs and things like that. I mean, a lot of that stuff is no longer around, is it? But you were saying that the payback is quicker. It seems to be quicker than ever. So this presumably is a really good time to be thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, it's mainly due to the cost of panels. They're a tenth of what they were even 10, 12 years ago. Yeah. So it's and now combined with the rising cost of electric means we've never seen such good returns.
Yeah. Peter, I wonder if I could turn to you now. As I mentioned in the intro, you've actually, you've been involved in installing solar panels for your company and that sort of thing. Tell me about first of all, tell me about your experience of that and how that has changed over the years, because you've done more than one installation.
Recently, with the increase in energy prices, back sort of 2 years ago, we were paying 14 pence a kilowatt hour. This current year, we're now paying 60. So it's a massive increase. And we started looking at new schemes that we could do. We've got effectively 3 freehold properties within the group. So we decided to invest in solar at 2 of them. We went through a tender process. We used a company called Auditel who help us with our energy pricing, and they put us in touch with a consultant. We got a spec together. We looked at even before we went out to tender at what the potential return on investments would be. We then went out to tender, and Solarsense were certainly by far the best supplier, and we went down the road with them. Did take reasonable time to come to fruition. The whole scheme for one of the sites, it took around about 12 months, and for the other site a little bit longer, about 15 months. So it's not a short-term fix really. And I guess the other thing is we own the properties, so these are very long-term investments, probably 20-year life. We chose to fund them over 5 years, so essentially the first 5 years are probably going to be relatively cash neutral, but after that we've got 15 years of positive cash flows. So that was the decision that we took. We'd already done various things to reduce our usage. We'd installed LED lighting at all of our sites. We'd done some controls on boilers, and we got the lights that automatically turn off and various other things. But this is essentially saving us around about 40% of our electric bills at both sites. And obviously makes sense to long-term investment. Although I would say we do operate our sites from generally 6 in the morning till midnight. So we offer essentially 5.5 days a week. So most of the energy we generate, we use internally. Probably 70–75% of what we generate, we use ourselves. If you're putting a lot more out to the grid, then it may be that the payback will be quite a bit longer, I would imagine.
Yeah, Peter, could you mentioned something there at the beginning of your answer, which is very interesting, about getting a consultant in to establish how much energy you were using and all those sorts of things. And presumably that's quite important that you have the data.
Yes.
So that you know, because otherwise you can't work out the ROI, can you, if you don't know the data in the first place?
Not at all. We looked at the half-hourly data going back effectively 2 years to give us a good idea of what energy we were using, when we were using it, and then we matched that with what we felt was what the solar potentially could generate. And obviously, if you think about the way solar works, in the winter, obviously it's short days, dark days, you don't generate as much, whereas in the summer, obviously you generate a lot more. So it tends to be a bit of a sort of normal distribution curve, really, in terms of the solar that you generate, and we map that against our electric usage to try and work out the best combination, the best number of panels to make the thing stack up. So obviously, the more panels, the more expensive, but the more potential you're putting out to the grid, which means you aren't using it internally. And for us, it was all about trying to use it internally, because that's where you get the quickest return on investment.
Yeah. Stephen, if I could just return to you quickly, that business of understanding the current situation in terms of your energy usage, and presumably when clients come to you and say, we're interested in solar, is that presumably that's something you have to encourage them to do, to understand where they are at the moment?
Yes, that's very much. We would ask them to send us half-hourly metering if they have it. Larger companies, smaller businesses, we just want to see their yearly fuel bills, because it is important to work out how much you use. You want to be using 70% of that power or more to get the best returns, because obviously if you end up exporting a lot, you're not getting such a good return. You may only be getting between 5 and 10 pence a unit. Well, nowadays a lot of people are paying up to 30 pence or more. So it's better to try and use that power. And this is where factories often are the best case rather than a householder, because they're 9 to 5. I can see Peter's even earlier, 6 to midnight, but you are daytime. So that's often the best case for solar power, is daytime use, just using it yourself.
Yeah. Kevin, I wonder if I could turn to you now, because obviously your case is slightly different, because you oversaw a big installation for a rugby club. So I suppose that's slightly different to maybe a normal commercial business. So tell me about your experience and in terms of grants and finance and that sort of thing, and how that felt from your point of view.
Yeah, St Mary's is a typical grassroots rugby club, and obviously one of the issues with the rugby club is it's a predominantly winter-based sport. So we were very keen to look at reducing our carbon impact, but the big driver for us was we couldn't afford our electricity, a bit like Peter, when it was 16.5p. And even though we got a great deal at 22.5p, it would have made a huge difference to our ability to stay open and invest in the club. We got a company called 7Y, who are consultants who are great. Site visit, really important, not laptop. And therefore they were able to demonstrate what we needed to do to make the clubhouse as energy efficient as possible prior to investing in solar. We looked at solar and air source heat pumps because I found the European Regional Development Fund was still running, and this is in September last year. We were in fact the final organisation to benefit from it. They paid 30% of the cost of the bill, but what they did drive was us writing a proper tender document and doing proper tender assessment, which was really, really useful. The balance came from a 10-year 2% simple interest loan with a 2-year holiday from the RFU at the time. So we managed to fund it fully, and then subsequent to that, we found a supporter who was able to pay that off. So we're going to pay that off over the 10 years. So whilst we've got a loan on the books, in fact, from day one, it's cash flow positive.
Yeah, that's very good. And I believe I think I said in your introduction that you, as well as panels, you also install batteries.
Yes, incredibly important for us because we are as I say, a winter-based sport. The biggest draw on our energy, probably like any club, is our back bar and cellars, and they run 24 hours a day. So we put the energy obviously into the clubhouse during the day, and then we can run the floodlights at night and the back bar for 24 hours a day. And we have 2 8-kilowatt-hour batteries. They work brilliantly. And really, really useful. We cannot export from St. Mary's. We don't have digital. We've got an analog meter, so therefore we can't. But again, we would only get 5p. And when I did the ROI, I assumed that we could, but I wrote off the export value, which would only come to about £300 a year, and thought that wasn't worth including in it. You're not really in control of that element. What you are, as Peter's pointed out, very much in control of where you use your energy. So again, I would say absolutely focus on utilising the energy within your organisation and make the most of it that way.
Yeah. Stephen, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how the quotation system works, because obviously when a client comes to you or when a potential client comes to you and says, we want to do this, and we, and they've presumably looked at the data for their electricity costs and that sort of thing. How do you express the quotation in terms that makes it obvious to them that this is a good thing to do, in terms of the longer term savings?
We use a system called PV Sol, which is a German system that can look at the weather conditions anywhere in the world, actually. And that can look at the angle of the roof, whereabouts, which part of the UK they are. And that will give a payback. That will give how much energy that will produce. And then we just look at what are they paying for electric, and then that gives the full payback. So we always recommend a feasibility study nowadays to look at that, to look at the structural, to ask DNO, which is probably the biggest thing. The DNO electrical company of your area may well say no, or they may well say you can only have so much power, or you've got to limit the power. So it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue, certainly on larger systems, that they're asked quite early. And this, as Peter can say, this can take some time. Certainly 4 months to 6 months is usual before solar can be installed.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to ask you about, is the issue. I mean, you hear sometimes in the media about rip-offs and things like that, you know, and sort of well, I don't know about scams, but certainly things that are not quite what they seem. I mean, as somebody who's been in the industry a long time, are you kind of conscious of that you're sometimes competing with, well, you know, people who are perhaps less than straightforward in the way they're you know, expressing their quotations?
Yeah, that's something we've always had in this industry. It seems to attract the double glazing type salesman. This is particularly in the domestic world. I think it's less common in the larger commercial world because you have to have more registration to be able to install commercial solar power. But certainly in the domestic world, that's common, and they seem to be appearing again. There's such a good payback nowadays. They're coming out the woodwork again.
Yeah. Peter, if I could get you to come back in here, in terms of, again, quotations and that sort of thing, did you presumably you put your jobs out to tender and got various quotations, that sort of thing? What was that experience like? And were you was it just about costs for you, or were you looking at other things?
I think cost obviously is very important, and yes, we did put it out. We created a tender document. We sent it out to, I think it was about 5 different potential suppliers. At the time, because energy price was so high, every single supplier was very busy. So initially, we needed to work out which suppliers could do it in a reasonable time frame. And we had our criteria that we used to score suppliers, and that's how Solarsense came out on top and won this particular tender. But yeah, it was it's an important part of the process, really.
Yeah,
someone that you can trust and that you can work with.
yeah. And is it fairly, you know, when you are going out to tender for these things and you get various quotations in, I mean, you know, I just mentioned to Stephen about the people who perhaps were less, you know, slightly more dubious suppliers, if I can put it politely. Did you get any of that? Did you get people who you sort of thought, don't think they know what they're doing?
No, not at all. I guess we were talking about some fairly large systems. Yeah, the Hythe one was sort of about 200 kilowatt potential, and the Southampton was almost 300. So they're quite big systems. Obviously, a lot of cost involved. So I guess that probably tends to weed out the less scrupulous suppliers, to be honest.
Yeah, and
in the commercial space, I guess that's probably far less likely than it is on the the residential side of things.
Yeah. And as Stephen said, yeah, exactly that. You know, the business side is perhaps more protected from that sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to ask you, Kevin, was sorry, the other thing I wanted to ask you, Peter, was about the I will come to Kevin in a second. Stop myself getting confused. Was about when you're sort of making the case internally to your, you know, to the board and that sort of thing, because obviously you're having to justify spending all this money. Is it important that you get a lot of feedback from the suppliers so that you can, you know, so you've got the graphs, you've got the, you know, the realistic ROIs and all that sort of thing? Is that something that is a big part of it for you?
Yeah, it was very important, really, because at the time we were doing this project, the prices were probably, well, as high as they've ever been. You know, the price of electric was probably around about 60 pence a kilowatt hour, which obviously made the payback very short. But obviously, one of the questions was what is going to happen to electric prices in the future? You know, are they going to go back down to 14p or even to 6p? In which case, it really extends the the payback period. But our view was that although prices were very likely to come down, certainly within the next sort of 12, 18 months, we didn't feel they would ever come down to the levels they were before, which is why we worked the payback on a price around about 30 pence a kilowatt hour, and that worked out to around about 5 years for both the schemes that we did. And we felt, for essentially an asset that's going to have a 20-year life, a 5-year payback is pretty good.
Yeah.
I think the other thing with these schemes is it provides us with a very good hedge against future electric volatility. We know the cost of essentially 40% of our electric for the next 20 years.
Yeah,
which is it gives you quite a lot of comfort at night.
Yeah. Kevin, that point about the, justifying the scheme internally. Presumably that was something that perhaps even more so in your case, with a non-profit and all that, sort of trying to justify that to the trustees or whoever it is who helps you make the decisions about these things.
Yes. So there was two elements to that. One, I looked at lots of research groups, and there's one based in Cornwall, which is quoted by the BBC quite extensively. That spoke to the projected electricity costs in the future. I didn't want anyone running away with the idea that the electricity price is always going to be sky high, very much like Peter. So that was one element, was finding external groups that were that had credible research. And then the second element was I took the Solarsense return on investment and tweaked it to us, because we are, as I say, winter-based sport. So I took a very pessimistic view on return on investment, because what I wanted to do was demonstrate. So basically, we were going to under-promise and over-deliver, which, when you're volunteers working with volunteers, I think is incredibly important. So that gave credibility. So our return on investment was slightly longer than Solarsense had projected, but that was purely because we wanted to make sure that we were, absolutely being as upfront as humanly possible. The other element that was challenging was that there's an awful lot of people have an awful lot of facts about the solar industry, all based on what one of their neighbours did in their house 15 or 20 years ago. And so I honestly spent a huge amount of time having to accept those views and then try and steer them towards where we are currently.
Yeah. And did you find when you were, talking to the other decision makers in your organization that they also had, perhaps some out of date, ideas of what solar was and could be and that sort of thing?
Not necessarily amongst the decision-making group, because it's quite a small group. We've got a small board, but certainly the wider club, who were very engaged. And we held, and this is very important, we held an extraordinary general meeting. We didn't need to constitutionally, but because it was the largest capital outlay since the club was built 30 years ago, we wanted to have whole club buy-in. So I prepared a lot of documents. We did presentations throughout the various elements of the club, and then had an EGM on which they voted whether they wished to accept the project or not. Clearly it was successful. But you talk about engagement and communication. Sometimes you could communicate and not get any feedback. So we felt it was important to have that vote.
Yeah. Stephen, that was interesting, wasn't it? What Kevin just said about, out of date ideas and views, because solar's been around quite a long time now, as you know, because you've been in the industry a long time, and things have changed a lot, quite apart from electricity prices. And you mentioned that the cost of the panels has dropped hugely over the years. But do you find that people still have rather old-fashioned notions when they come to you looking for advice?
Well, we do, yes. A lot of people think it wasn't worthwhile after the end of the feed-in tariff, because the government stopped the feed-in tariffs. But of course, in some ways, they had to stop them because solar was getting such a good payback. It didn't need that government support. In fact, sometimes, a lot of ways the government support got in the way. It caused what we call a solar coaster. We had mad rushes to the deadlines and then no business afterwards. Did a lot of damage in a lot of respects. But people are now sort of, obviously, since the big rise in electric prices, people are looking at solar differently, and obviously the environmental side of this is becoming more and more important. So we are seeing quite a difference nowadays. Yeah.
And do you think, Stephen, that if a company is looking at solar as a route to being carbon neutral and maybe even putting an end to having electricity bills at all, is that realistic, or should they be, should they be a bit more pragmatic than that?
Well, it's part of the mix. You should be looking at LED lighting, insulation, and then what can you do? And obviously, solar power on the roof is the easiest thing. Certainly in a town situation, wind power is obviously is what you need really if you're going to try and be zero energy. You need something for the winter, because solar is much less in the winter period. So a lot of people see that they would have a surplus in the summer, and that would offset the winter and be carbon neutral over the year. But normally it's a percentage. Like Peter was saying, it could be 40%, it could be 60% of your power.
Yeah.
Which is good. You know, that's a big step.
Yeah, absolutely. And Peter, before I apologise to Ellie and Gaige. I've been ignoring them, and I am going to come to you guys in a second, I promise. But before I do, Peter, I just wonder, that business of, you mentioned LED lighting, I think, as well, and presumably just energy efficiency generally in the building, good, presumably good insulation and all that sort of thing. Those are all kind of precursors as well to doing a good and effective solar installation.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think you need to try and do everything you can to reduce your consumption, because ultimately that's the cheapest form of electricity, isn't it? The one you don't actually use. So yeah, we went through a stage of trying to do all these other things, the LED lights, the insulation, the automatic lights turning off and on, and that type of thing. But then obviously you get to a point where there's only so much you can do. Unfortunately, some of our buildings are quite old. The Southampton one goes back probably 40, 50 years. So it's not the best from an insulation perspective. So yeah, the solar scheme seemed the next step and the sensible thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, look, we've talked a lot about the installation and the the reasoning behind it, and the and the feasibility of it, and having the right data and all that sort of thing. But all of that is just it kind of doesn't matter unless you can get the funding, and you can find out, sort out a way of paying for this stuff, whether it becomes cash neutral or not. And so we've got two experts here who are going to help us with that today. As I said earlier, we've got Ellie, who is from Ignition Credit, and we've got Gaige, who's from SmartEase. Ellie, if I could start with you. Talk to me about asset finance, because I think probably a lot of people know what it is, but let's just define it so we know what we're talking about here.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you, Dave, and good morning to everybody. So Ignition Credit is an asset finance. We're asset finance, and we're both a broker and a funder ourselves. We deal with about 30 different funders, which allows us to really understand the market and the opportunities that are there. Asset finance in itself is really just a term to describe leasing and hire purchase solutions. We are actually the third most common source of finance after overdrafts and loans. So we're very commonly used. Funding is often used to obtain equipment, tangible assets, from anything from a coffee machine through to manufacturing, plant, cars, and obviously solar. As we've kind of listened to the other panelists today, there is significant cash flow and tax benefits for using it as well. We always say, from a tax point of view, to speak to your accountant, because obviously the accountant is there to kind of dig in and understand it in its entirety. But for example, on an HP, which I'll go into in a moment, that qualifies 100% for capital allowances in year one. And I'll show you an example in a moment. So there's some really good cost-effective use within it. So within asset finance, you have two solutions, HP and lease. Basically, how does HP work? It's basically you're renting over a contracted period. You take automatic ownership at the end of all of your payments. So if it's a 5 or 6 year term, you make your last payment and you pay a token option to purchase fee, which then allows you to take that ownership. There's no further charges. Your payments are fixed during that time, so you know exactly through your cash flow and can manage your cash flow to know that there's no price escalation, and you know what your payments will be for that entire period. And there's no contract transfer that's needed at all. From a lease perspective, it's very similar to HP, but the VAT is paid on each monthly payment as opposed to having to pay for that up front. And you have got 3 solutions and options at the end. that you can either extend the term so that you can move to a more reduced rental, or you can sell the equipment to an independent third party, or the customer can actually purchase it for fair market value. And you can receive tax relief on those lease payments as well. I think from an asset finance perspective, the key for us, very much being down here in the Southwest, is that understanding and knowing your market and being quite holistic. We understand the turmoil that everyone's trying to kind of get within green energy at the moment and find their feet through it. So it's about knowing what else and the other options that we can direct our customers to as well, which is really important.
And Ellie, I wonder as well about, because interest rates clearly have been on everybody's minds recently, as they've gone up and up and up. Does that have an effect? I mean, presumably, you that does affect what you're paying back with your asset finance.
Yeah, it will concern people. There's been, I think, 13 rises in base rates since December 21. So we've seen our clients go through a huge, and customers out there, huge change with the financial landscape. However, solar is one of the best investments business owners can make, and it's very much, strongly advertised out there because it pays for itself. In most of the scenarios, you're looking at a solution whereby just short of 5 years, you've got payback, and then you're going into a positive cash flow afterwards. I know as well that the MCS data that's available at the moment, that up to August 2023, there was more solar power systems than the whole of 2022, and it was an annual record. So we're seeing that the confidence is there, traction is moving forward. And even the Net Zero Secretary, Claire Coutinho, I believe her name is, she came out yesterday and said that they're looking to very much extend and make it easier to put even more roof space for solar panels. So they're also pushing that forward. So I think now is as good a time as any, and is absolutely the best way to go forward from your green energy perspective.
And Ellie, I wonder if quickly you could give us an example. I've got on my notes here, I've got I do have notes. it says something about Cornish Premier Pasties as a good example of a project you worked on. Tell us quickly about that, and just as an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cornish Premier Pasties, they've just had 320 panels installed, about 131 kilowatt system. Again, Solarsense were very much integral to the part of the project there. I've known the client for many years. As my introduction, I've got sort of 30 years within the finance landscape. We're down here in the Southwest, but we are very much community based. We believe in the value of face-to-face and being present and understanding our client's business holistically. So Mark, I had known for a long time. And really, without kind of explaining his cash flow situation specifically, because that wouldn't be right to do, he knew that from a tax point of view and also from a kind of cost benefit point of view, this was the right solution for him. It was a no-brainer. The payback would be in under 5 years. 20% of his energy was going to be produced over the year. And I think on a sunny day, it's something as much as 98%, which is absolutely huge. And obviously from a green perspective, I think he was saving 50 tons of CO2 a year, which is, for the community is absolutely brilliant. Yeah. And down here in the Southwest, as well as the rest of the country, B Corp is huge. And there's lots of waves making, kind of working at the moment with groups forming to understand that whole green energy perspective and landscape that is out there.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. Gaige, I think obviously you're also involved in asset finance, and I also want to talk to you about something called a power purchase agreement. But before we do that, tell me about your perspective on finance in the landscape we're in now. With, as I mentioned to Ellie, interest rates going up and all that sort of thing. How are you finding your customers? Are people still confident about investing in this sort of thing, do you think?
Hi all, my name is Gaige, Sales Director for SmartEase UK. So yeah, interest rates are definitely having an effect on customers. It's definitely a question that's quite commonly asked. And fundamentally, when I speak to our customers, it comes down to the bottom line, right? What are the benefits or what are the savings versus what are the repayments? And 90, almost 100% of the time, it's cash flow positive from day one. So when we really look at doing solar versus not doing solar, there's a cost to doing nothing, right? There's a cost to doing nothing, especially when solar pays for itself in the first month, right? And when you fund and finance a solar solution, you're no longer waiting for 3, 4, 5 years to see your money back into your bank account, right? You're seeing it in the first month because it's cash flow positive from day one.
Yeah, that's interesting. And tell me about this power purchase agreement, because that's a kind of different way of doing it, isn't it? What's involved there?
Sure. There's two main ways you'll fund a solar solution. One is asset finance, which Ali has done a good job explaining. The alternative is a power purchase agreement. So a power purchase agreement, which is PPA for short, is, well, what is it? An on-site PPA is a long-term electricity supply contract. It enables you as a business owner to install a solar system on your premises without any capital outlay. Us or your PPA provider will own, operate, and maintain the solar system, and will sell you the electricity that's supplied from the system. So you pay for what you use. That is all. Now, what's the real benefit? It's typically significantly lower than what you would pay for grid-sourced energy. Typically 50%. If you're paying 30 pence, the PPA rate is often 10 to 13 pence per kilowatt hour, to give you an example. And lastly, it's ideal for larger businesses that operate during daylight hours typically, right?
Thank you, Gaige. That's great. I am going to come back to you guys, but I want to introduce another panelist who has arrived a little late on the scene, Tim Cook. Tim is the commercial energy consultant at Solarsense and has more than a decade of experience in the clean energy sector. And he works with a wide range of businesses to deliver strategic direction for their ongoing energy needs. Welcome, Tim. Sorry you got a bit held up there. You've obviously missed a fair bit of the conversation, but Stephen has been doing an excellent job of pretending to be you, and you've got to pat him on the back for that. Tim, I wonder, I was just asking Ellie and Gaige about the finance, asset finance, and this PPA idea, and also talking about the general sort of environment that we're working in now with rising interest rates and high inflation and all those sorts of things. I mean, are you seeing, from your point of view, you're at the sharp end of this, talking to your customers every day and your potential customers. How are they, are they worried about the financial side, or do they just see the obvious benefits of this straight away?
I think there is definitely an obvious benefit there from our perspective. I think a lot of clients do need a little bit leading through that process. Many people have realized that energy prices have skyrocketed over the last 24 months. And whilst they have stabilized, they're probably not going to go back to the levels that they were pre the 2019, 2020. And therefore, the return on investment now, actually, Dave, we're seeing is as good, if not better, than it would have been back in the days of the feed-in tariff. So I think there is this kind of maybe misconception that when the feed-in tariff was here, that was the heyday, that was when we should have been investing, and have we missed the boat? The answer, the response to that is definitely no, you have not, because the capital cost of investing is so much lower. And there is truth that the interest rates have risen over the last 12 months, and that does have an effect on the payback. But because the cost of electricity has gone up so astronomically as well, that actually brings the payback back into a very favorable position. And most clients are seeing, that under kind of 6-year payback for their solar system, which means if they have done an asset finance, in many cases, it washes its own face, it breaks even over a 5, 6, 7-year period, which is then attractive.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. And Peter, I earlier on, I think we talked about the fact, or I think I mentioned in the intro, that you used asset finance, I think with Gaige's company. And what was your experience of that? And again, presumably that was all about, just working out. I think you said that, the first 5 years you kind of broke even, and after that it's cash positive.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, it was a question of where do we want to use our cash. Obviously, this is a long-term investment. Initially, we were just going to fund it through retained reserves, but we took the decision that it made sense to fund it. So yeah, from our perspective, 20-year investment, first 5 years will be cash neutral-ish, maybe slightly positive, but then after that, it's pure cash positive. So that was the view we took on this particular investment.
Yeah. Ellie, could I just put you on the spot a second? Because obviously you talked about asset finance, and clearly that's a very good way of doing this from what you and Gaige are saying. But I wonder, if somebody says, well, I can just go and get a bank loan, or I can just, I don't know, find some investors or something like that. I mean, presumably you get people kind of trying to compare those things.
Absolutely. From a bank loan perspective, you're probably looking at it being unsecured, depending on the bank's parameters. I mean, having been an ex-banker myself, I understand the timescales involved in these things. But as Gaige has said, I think from the energy point of view, asset finance or the PPA solution is definitely the way forward, because it is looking at putting the funding through, but obviously the tax benefits that are there with the full expensing as well from an asset finance purchase point of view. I mean, to give you an example, if somebody was to had gross annual taxable profit, let's say of £200,000, that means they'd have a corporation tax bill of 50,000. A new £200,000 solar system would then wipe off, in very high level terms, that corporation tax. So by utilising something such as asset finance and being able to qualify under full expensing, it really is advantageous for the client to look at that point of view, rather than the conventional funding, and obviously using their cash reserves when they're important to hold on to at this time.
Gaige, could I come back to you now, because I know I wanted to talk to you about affordability, and I know you've got some interesting graphics that I think you may be able to share with us quickly, which kind of demonstrate that. So maybe you could do that and talk us through that, because I think they are they do illustrate the point very well.
No worries. I'll share my screen shortly. Can you see that? Okay, Dave.
Yeah, that looks good. Yeah. So talk us through that then.
If you can afford your bill, you can afford to go solar. Okay. So here's a classic graph, and this is one of the standard ways one of our partners would present this to an end user business looking to install solar. In the light gray here, you've got the electricity bill before solar is installed. Okay, that's the current energy bill. In the dark blue here, we've got the electricity bill with the it's a reduced electricity bill because there's savings made from the solar. And then the light blue here are the repayments for the asset finance. And this is a clear example of asset finance. The net position after financing a solar system is your net costs are better than what you were currently paying previous. And this demonstrates cash flow positive, right? Now you can see here a standard term that we typically fund is 7 years. After the 7 years has elapsed, you get the full benefit thereafter. And you've got a system lifespan of 20 to 30 years and then some.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It certainly is quite convincing. And so tell us about this one then.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of these to show you. So this is, if you want to look at it and drill down on a month-on-month basis, this is the current electricity bill. And in yellow, that's the reduced electricity bill with solar installed. And those are the repayments on top. You can clearly see it's cash flow positive. The solar self-funds. And in this exact example for a client that I've looked after last week, actually, they reduced their electricity bill by 45% by installing solar PV. And they reallocated 25% of their savings towards the asset finance payment plan. The net result is they're making a 20% profit after their costs. Okay.
And Gaige, are these? I mean, obviously you've chosen an example there that's an actual customer, as you said, but are these going to be typical? Whatever size of business you're running.
Typical, right? So this is what gives a customer the flexibility of the term length. Asset finance, we can do anything from 2 years up to 10 years. So it may not be cash flow positive on a 3-year term, but it might be cost neutral on a 5-year term and cash flow positive on a 7-year term. The longer the term, the lower the repayment, the better the cash flow. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And this is the last slide. This is the same customer I showed you above. In the first year, real savings is £30,000 in the first year. Across the 7-year payment plan, they've made a £335,000 profit. That's savings less repayments. And over the lifespan of the system, it's £2.7 million. We're not asking customers to spend any more than they currently are. Right? We're asking them to reduce their costs and do it in a smart way.
Yeah, and what size of business is this, Gaige? Just to give us a sense.
This here is a 300 kilowatt, got £250,000 installment.
Right,
and
right.
That was the amount funded.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for sharing those with us, Gaige. Those are very interesting. Tim, that is fascinating, isn't it? Seeing it sort of displayed in a graphical form like that. I mean, it's pretty convincing argument, isn't it?
Absolutely, Gaige illustrated that very well, and it's something we come across regularly. That yes, you can look at good capital, good return for your investment, or in many cases, not even having to make that investment and still being cash flow positive. And we would often work with a finance provider to try and facilitate that. So it needn't be an expensive thing for the business on its bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just talk to Peter and Kevin for a second as well. Kevin, did you see? I mean, seeing those graphs, obviously, it's quite convincing, isn't it? Did you see graphs like that before you made your decisions? Were you able to? Did you know that was those were the sort of savings?
Yes, yeah, I did, yeah. Absolutely. We've got a couple of challenges because we're not on smart meters, so it restricted our choices, and our turnover as a business, and our tax as a cask didn't make some of the financing as beneficial as they do to more commercially based businesses. But yeah, incredibly important to have the data to be able to examine. I was the champion, but all I was doing was trying to get all the information I possibly could, and saying all the way through, yes, I'm championing this, but I want to do the right thing by the club, as all of you do with your businesses. Just because you're the leader of it doesn't mean to say you're necessarily wedded to it. So, it was incredibly important to have all that information available.
Yeah. And Peter, in your experience, do those graphs reflect reality?
So far, yes. We've had essentially we've got a portal that we can view the two schemes on, and so you can see for days then you're just not taking anything from the grid at all. We've had days where we've literally been 98-99% self-sufficient. Obviously, it's been quite bright this summer. It's been a good summer, so that's probably helped. But it's quite nice to actually see when you see it in black and white.
Good. Well, that's
sorry, Gaige. Just one quick thing. That's
yeah,
that even in the worst days of the winter, we were still generating 30% of our electricity. So it had a massive impact even at our worst times.
Yeah. Well, these are very, very convincing figures to me as a layman. I'm very impressed with this. But listen, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left of the webinar, and I really want to try and get a couple of questions from our audience, which have been submitted. So the first one, which I'm going to initially put to Tim, I think, somebody has asked about solar carports, and are they a good investment? So I presume what they're talking about then is kind of converting your car park into some sort of covered area with the covers over the cars being solar panels. Is that what that means?
Absolutely. Yeah, you've probably seen them if you go on holiday to Italy or France or somewhere where they use them initially as shades for the cars to stop them getting too hot. Unfortunately, we don't have that problem in the UK, but they can prove as a very good additional area for a business to have solar panels then put on top of these frames to produce more energy. I guess I would just point out we do get a lot of inquiries for carports, and we have installed numerous across the UK now, some quite large systems. They are always a second resort, really. The roof is definitely going to be a cheaper option if your roof can sustain it. And that would be where you would start. And then as a further expansion, we would look at doing the solar carports, because they are in round numbers twice the cost, because you've got not only the solar system, but also now the framework and the building in order to put the solar panels on. But yes, absolutely something that we can assist with.
And what about and does that tie in with electric cars and things like that? You know, people driving to work in an electric car, they want a charging point. I mean, could you potentially be, you know, getting free electricity to charge your staff's cars?
Yes, with the caveat of the fact that the solar panels are not going to be necessarily sufficient to provide that power at all times. So it would never be a standalone system. It would always be connected to your building, so that it will contribute towards the general business premises supply by providing energy from the solar system. And then when the cars are plugged in and that demand really peaks, any requirement from the building can help the solar panels meet that. So yes, it can. And it does operate as a very nice kind of visual green policy, I guess, because if you've got roof mounted solar, it's obviously quite hidden. But if you've got then a bank of car EV chargers and a row of solar carports, it can look the part.
Yeah. Peter, have you considered that sort of thing, or have you in fact got anything like that?
No, we haven't. No, definitely not.
Is it tempting?
We don't have the space, to be honest. It would be difficult for us. We've got large workshops. We service, effectively trucks. They take up a lot of space. So yeah, not at this point in time.
Not at this point in time. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, sorry, Tim.
That's all right. Well, at least you know.
No, I agree.
There. But as with all this stuff, you know, it's got to be right for you, hasn't it? You can't do it for the sake of it. You've got to do it because it's right for the business.
Yeah, very much so. Ultimately, for us, although it's very nice to do and it's the right thing to do, it had to make costs. You had to be able to justify it from a cost perspective.
Yeah, of course. I've got another question here from George Browning has said, and maybe you can. I'll read you the question, and you can, and maybe Tim, you can perhaps enlighten us a bit about this. George is saying, are many taking advantage of the Smart Export Guarantee Scheme, or are most actually using all the generated electricity from their solar? Does that question make sense to you, Tim?
Yes, it does. So the Smart Export Guarantee Scheme, to be honest, is more aimed at the domestic market. Essentially means that the power companies have to pay you something for the exported electricity, but there is no given rate for that. So you can do it, and you can contact British Gas or whoever you're with and get your exported export payments. You may well only get 3, 4, 5p. The alternative is that we work with a number of off-takers, specialist off-takers, so companies that are wanting renewable energy and will pay a premium to you for that. It does mean that you need to make sure that the meter is compatible and set up what's called meter operator contracts, MOP contracts, but we can do all of that for you, and it would then mean that you can probably get rates nearer 10p. So there is quite a big additional saving if you've got a reasonable amount of export. If you're only exporting a small amount, then you might as well go through the Smart Export Guarantee. But just a point on that, David, I think it's everybody's wish to use all that they generate on site. I get told that all the time. Oh, well, we don't want to export anything to grid, we want to use it on site. Well, yes, but it's in real time only. So if your solar system is producing 100 kilowatts and you are only using 50 because it's a weekend, you will be exporting 50 to the grid. So if you haven't set up any export agreement, whether that's through the Smart Export Guarantee or a third-party off-taker, you will just be giving the power company that month that electricity for free. So it is important that you set that up. Or, of course, you consider having a battery where you can then store that energy for use at an alternative time.
Yeah, because I was going to say, because Kevin went down the route of the battery because they couldn't. I think, Kevin, I'm right in saying you couldn't export because you didn't have a digital system. So the batteries was your answer to that.
Yes, and the fact that we, obviously our floodlights are on in the dark and our back bar is 24 hours a day. So most of our energy is used at night. So therefore, having the batteries make complete sense and economic sense for us.
Yeah, yeah.
So almost for Kevin's, it's like a domestic profile whereby you've got your generation during the day and everybody's out at work, and then you come in the evening and you want your power, which works very well domestically. But a lot of commercial businesses are operating during the day and during daylight hours, and that's why the generation with solar works so well, probably without the need for battery. But we would look at it as a case-by-case basis, looking at the half-hourly data if we've got it, or a minimum just taking into account your operating hours to be able to evaluate that for you.
Yeah, and Peter, apologies if I've already asked you this, but I think I'm right in saying that you use virtually all of your electricity, so there isn't much of an export issue for you, is that right?
No, we set up export contracts because we're not there Saturday afternoon or Sunday.
Yeah.
But most of the rest of the electric we generate, we use ourselves, which is, I think, the best solution, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Gaige, I wonder if I could just ask you one quick question, which I actually forgot to ask you earlier, and that's for people who lease buildings and that sort of thing, and who are not the owners. Is presumably there are still avenues for them to get finance and that sort of thing? If you could just give me a quick answer to that, because we're nearly out of time.
Yeah, of course. Look, both asset finance and PPA models work well for tenants and those who lease their buildings. From an asset finance perspective, it's no different. Installing a solar PV system to us as financiers is no different to an EV charger or an air source heat pump, right? If your landlord says, yes, you can install it, and it'll be fully funded. From a PPA, power purchase agreement perspective, you as a tenant can align the PPA contract with your existing lease contract. Your landlord will sign a rooftop lease and we'll provide a share of the revenue we receive. So at the end of the term, we can either gift the solar system to the tenant or the landlord. And ultimately what it boils down to is the tenant can receive a reduced energy cost. They can create a natural hedge and basically fix that portion of their electricity. The landlord receives a revenue stream without taking on any additional risk. We as the PPA fund own and operate and maintain and ensure that solar PV system. So overall, it works for us as a funder, the landlord as the building owner, and the tenant who's ultimately looking after the electricity contract.
Well, I'm sorry to cut you short, Gaige. I'm afraid we're out of time, and we could carry on talking about this all day. I wanted to bring Ellie back in as well, but I'm afraid we are out of time. So thank you all for joining us on this Solarsense webinar on finance, funding, and the return on investment. A big thank you to our expert panel, Tim Cook from Solarsense, Peter Booth from MC Group, Kevin Mulvaney from England Rugby, Ellie Smith from Ignition Credit, Gaige Ross from SmartEase, and of course, Stephen Barrett, the MD and founder of Solarsense. We hope you've gained some valuable insight from our expert panel, but if we haven't managed to answer your particular questions, please do get in touch with Solarsense via their website to get further information or to address specific queries. In the meantime, thanks for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.